They say a crown weighs nothing until the moment it is offered to someone else. Margaret learned the truth of that on a gray morning in the coldest spring Aldermere had known in 40 years. When she stood in a corridor she had walked 10,000 times and found, for the first time in her life, that the great oak doors at its end would not open for her. She was 61 years old. She had given her whole life to that house behind those doors. And now a footman she had known since he was a boy stood in front of them with his eyes fixed on the floor, and would not meet her gaze, and would not step aside. Before we reach that door, you should understand who was on the other side of it, and why a woman who had never once raised her voice in public was about to feel the ground open beneath her feet. This is a story about a crown, yes, but it is really a story about the long, quiet arithmetic of being overlooked, and what happens on the single morning when all of it comes due at once. Stay with it. The door does not stay closed forever, and what walks through it is not what anyone in Aldermere expected. Margaret had come to the royal house of Aldermere as a bride of 19, in a season when the old king, Aldous III, still hunted in the northern forests, and the country still believed its best years were ahead of it rather than behind. She had married the king's younger brother, Prince Reinhardt, in the cathedral at Velheim beneath a ceiling painted with saints, and she had believed, as brides do, that the shape of her life was now settled and known. She would be a duchess. She would raise children in the house of a great family. She would grow old in rooms warmed by fires that other people lit, and when she died she would be laid in the family crypt beside a husband she was learning, slowly, to love. For a while it went as she had imagined. Reinhardt was not an easy man. He was proud in the way of men who are born close to a throne but never quite on it, always aware of the small distance between himself and everything he wanted. But he was not cruel, and in the early years he was kind to her more often than not. They had a son, Aldrich, and then a daughter who lived only 4 days and was buried in a coffin so small that Margaret carried it herself, refusing every hand that reached to take it from her. That was the first time the house saw what she was made of. She did not weep in the corridors. She wept alone, and in company she stood straight, and people began to say of her that she was made of colder stuff than she looked. They were wrong about the cold, but they were right that she had learned, young, to keep her grief where no one could use it against her. The years turned. Old King Aldous died without a son of his own body, and the crown passed sideways and down through a tangle of cousins and councils until it settled, to the surprise of half the court, on Reinhardt's elder brother's line, on a boy named Cassian who was crowned at 12 and grew into a king who was clever and charming, and Margaret came to understand, entirely without loyalty to anyone but himself. Reinhardt served that boy king, and then the young man he became, served him as a counselor and a soldier and an uncle, and every year he grew a little more bitter that the great house of Aldermere, which he had done so much to hold together, would never be his to command. Margaret served too, though no one called it that. She ran the household when the stewards failed. She sat with dying courtiers so they would not die alone. When the young King Cassian took a foreign bride who spoke no word of the Aldermerian tongue and wept in her rooms for a year, it was Margaret who taught her the language and the customs, and how to hold her head in a court that whispered behind every pillar. When plague came to Velheim in the wet summer, it was Margaret who stayed in the city while the court fled to the hills, Margaret who organized the burning of the dead and the feeding of the orphans, Margaret whose face the common people learned to look for when things were at their worst. She asked for nothing in return. That was her mistake, though she would not understand it as a mistake until she was 61 and standing in front of a closed door. She had believed, because she had been raised to believe it, because the saints painted on the cathedral ceiling had promised it, that virtue was its own kind of currency, and that a life spent in service would be honored in the end. She had believed the house would remember what she had given it. The house remembers nothing. Only people remember, and people are careless, and the ones who owe the most are usually the ones who choose to forget. Reinhardt died in the 10th year of Cassian's reign, of a wet cough that turned to fever in the space of a fortnight. Margaret nursed him herself, would not leave the room, and at the end he held her hand and said something she would carry for the rest of her days. He said, "You should have been the one they crowned." Then he laughed because it was a foolish thing to say, an impossible thing. She was a duchess by marriage, no more, with no blood claim to anything. And then he stopped laughing because he saw that she was not laughing with him, and a little while after that he died. You should have been the one they crowned. She told herself it was fever talk, but it lodged in her like a splinter, and in the long widowed years that followed, she found herself turning it over on sleepless nights, not because she believed it, but because someone had finally said aloud the thing she had spent 40 years refusing to let herself want. Her son Aldrich was grown by then, and married, and had given her a granddaughter she adored beyond all reason. A bright, fierce girl named Alara who had Margaret's own straight back and something else besides. Something Margaret had lost or perhaps never had. The ability to want things out loud. Alara at 9 years old had announced to a room full of courtiers that she intended to be the cleverest woman in Aldermere, and the courtiers had laughed, and Alara had not been embarrassed at all. She had simply looked at them as though they were the ones who had said something foolish. Margaret had watched from the doorway and felt her heart turn over and thought, "There, that is what I could not do, that is what I should have taught myself." She poured herself into the girl. Everything she knew, languages, history, the reading of a room, the long patient art of surviving a court she gave to Alara across the years, in lessons that did not look like lessons, in stories told by the fire, in the small corrections of a grandmother's hand on a granddaughter's shoulder. Stand straighter. Do not let them see you flinch. Remember who was kind to you and who was not, but never let either one know that you are keeping the account. Alara absorbed it all. And Margaret, watching her grow, allowed herself at last a quiet, private ambition, not for herself, that was too late, but for the girl. Let Alara have what I did not. Let Alara be seen. She did not know how completely, and how cruelly, that wish would be granted. Trouble, when it came wearing the face of a friend. King Cassian, aging now and without a direct heir of his own, had begun the long, anxious business of deciding who would follow him. The house of Aldermere was thick with claimants, cousins and half-cousins, the descendants of old Aldous' scattered line, ambitious lords who could trace a drop of royal blood through 6 generations and a forged genealogy. And among the strongest of these claims, though few said it aloud, was the line of Reinhardt, Margaret's line. Her son Aldrich, her granddaughter Alara. Margaret understood the danger before Aldrich did. She had spent her life watching the court, and she knew that a strong claim was not a gift but a target. She counseled caution. She told her son to stay quiet, to serve the king faithfully, to give no one any reason to see the family as a threat. And for years it worked. The family kept its head down. Alara grew from a fierce girl into a formidable young woman, educated far beyond what anyone expected of a prince's granddaughter. And if the court noticed her at all, it was to remark that she was clever for a girl and a pity she would never have anywhere to put it. Then Aldrich died, not by any plot, a horse, a bad fall, a wet road, but he died, and suddenly the line of Reinhardt narrowed to a single point, and that point was Alara. And King Cassian, who had watched this quiet, clever girl grow up under his own roof, who had perhaps always known what she was, made a decision that would break Margaret's heart in a way that 40 years of grief had somehow left room for. He named Alara his heir. Margaret should have been overjoyed. In a sense she was. The wish of her heart, let the girl be seen, had been granted beyond anything she had dared to imagine. Her granddaughter would be queen. The house that had used Margaret and forgotten her would one day belong to Margaret's own blood. It was a triumph. It was everything. And yet from the moment the decision was announced, Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her in a way she could not name. Because Cassian, in nomming Alara, had made a second decision quietly, without announcement, and Margaret was slow to see it only because it was so unthinkable. He had decided that the old woman, the widow, the duchess who had given her life to the house, was no longer to be at the center of things. Ilara was the future. Ilara was to be surrounded by the king's own people, his chosen counselors, the bright, ambitious faces of the court's rising generation, and the grandmother who had made her. The grandmother was a relic of a sadder past, a reminder of dead men and buried children, a woman whose stern, straight-backed presence did not suit the shining new reign that Cassian wished to build. It began in small ways, an invitation that did not come, a seat at the council table that was quietly given to another, a conversation between the king and the heir that Margaret was not asked to join. Ilara, young and dazzled by her sudden ascent, did not notice, or noticed and did not understand, which amounts to the same wound. And Margaret, who had spent her whole life keeping her grief where no one could use it, said nothing and stood straighter and told herself it did not matter. But it was mattering. It was mattering more than anything had mattered in years. Because there was one thing left, one ceremony, one moment, one ancient and sacred rite that Margaret had assumed, without ever quite letting herself think it, would be hers. The crown of saints. It was the oldest treasure of Aldermere, older than the kingdom itself by some accounts. A circlet of dark gold set with 7 stones the color of old blood, said to have been worn by the first king who united the valley tribes under a single banner 1,000 years before. It was not the crown of state, the jeweled and gaudy thing that kings wore for coronations and processions. It was something older and stranger and more sacred. The crown of saints was brought out only once in a reign, at the nomming of an heir, and placed upon the heir's brow by the eldest surviving member of the royal house, in a private rite witnessed only by the family. It was the moment when the past reached forward and touched the future. It was blood acknowledging blood. And the eldest surviving member of the royal house of Aldermere, by every custom, by every law, by every year of service and grief and quiet endurance, was Margaret. She had not asked for it, she had not spoken of it, but somewhere in the buried and unlit places of her heart she had allowed herself to know that this, at last, would be her moment. She would place the ancient crown upon her granddaughter's head. She, who had been overlooked at every turn, would be the one whose hands consecrated the future of the house. It would be, she had let herself believe, a kind of justice, not spoken, not demanded, but real. The house would remember. On this one morning, in this one rite, 40 years of forgetting would be answered. She had a gown made for it. She told no one why. She had it stitched in the deep gray blue of the house of Reinhardt, and she stood before the glass in her rooms the night before the ceremony and looked at herself. An old woman, straight-backed, her hair silver, her hands steady. And she permitted herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to feel something that was almost like hope. She should have known better. Hope, in the house of Aldermere, was simply the last thing they took from you before the end. The morning came gray and cold, the coldest spring in 40 years. Margaret rose before her women, dressed with care, and walked the long familiar corridors toward the chamber of the rite, the ancient stone room at the heart of the house where the crown of saints waited on its cushion, and where, for 1,000 years, the old had crowned the young. She walked those corridors as she had walked them 10,000 times, and she felt, beneath her calm, a flutter she had not felt since she was a bride of 19. And she came at last to the great oak doors, and found a footman standing before them, young Piers, whom she had known since he was a boy of 6 carrying candles, whom she had once nursed through a fever when his own mother was too poor to send for a physician. Piers stood before the doors with his eyes on the floor, and when Margaret moved to enter, as she had every right in the world to do, Piers did not step aside. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper and he could not look at her. I am so very sorry, Your Grace. I have been told that you are not, that this morning the rite is to be." He could not finish it. He did not have to. Margaret stood very still in the cold corridor in her gray-blue gown, and understood all at once and completely what 40 years had been building toward. Somewhere behind those doors, the crown of saints was being lifted from its cushion. Somewhere behind those doors, her granddaughter's head was being bared for the touch of the past. And the hands that would do it, The hands that would place 1,000 years of blood upon Alara's brow were not going to be hers. She had been left outside the door. For a long moment Margaret did not move. The cold of the corridor came up through the stone and into the thin soles of her shoes, and she was aware of it in the way one is aware of small things at the worst moments, when the mind refuses the large thing in front of it and busies itself with the small. Her feet were cold. Piers was crying, silently, the tears running down a face she had watched grow from childhood. Somewhere far off in the house, a bell was ringing the hour. And behind the great oak doors, muffled and indistinct, she could hear the low murmur of voices raised in the words of the ancient rite, words she knew by heart, words she had learned as a bride so that she might one day speak them, words that another mouth was speaking now. "Who?" she said. Her voice did not shake. She had spent 61 years making certain her voice would not shake, and it did not fail her now. "Who is placing the crown, Piers?" The boy, he was not a boy, he was a man of 30, but she would always see the child in him, looked up at last, and the misery in his face told her half the answer before he spoke. "The Lord Chancellor, your Grace. Lord Valic. The king commanded it," he said. Piers swallowed. He said the rite was to be performed by the highest officer of the realm to mark the modern age, the new reign. He said it was fitting. "Valeric." Margaret almost laughed, and the almost laugh was worse than any weeping could have been. Valeric was 52 years old and had come to court 20 years ago as the clever, ambitious son of a merchant house, and he had climbed and climbed on the strength of his usefulness to King Cassian and his complete indifference to anyone who could not advance him. He had no blood claim to anything. He was not a member of the royal house. By every law and custom of 1,000 years, he had no more right to lift the crown of saints than the footman weeping in front of the door. But he was the highest officer of the realm, and he was young enough and modern enough to suit the reign Cassian wished to build. And he was, above all, not Margaret, not the gray relic of a sadder past, not the widow who reminded everyone of dead men and buried children. The king had not merely overlooked her. He had reached into the oldest and most sacred rite of the house and rewritten it, so that the woman who had every right to stand at its center would instead stand outside a closed door in a cold corridor, in a gown she had made for a moment that would never come. And Alara, that was the part that did not bear thinking of, and so of course it was the part Margaret's mind went to and would not leave. Alara was inside. Alara was letting it happen. Her granddaughter, the fierce girl who had announced at 9 years old that she would be the cleverest woman in Aldermere, the girl Margaret had poured her whole self into, was standing at this moment with her head bared, letting a merchant's son place the crown of her ancestors upon her brow, while the grandmother who had made her stood forgotten on the wrong side of the door. Did she know? That was the question that would haunt Margaret through everything that came after. Did Alara know her grandmother was outside? Had she been told and accepted it? Or had they kept it from her too, arranged it all so smoothly, so quietly, that the girl believed this was simply how the rite was done? Margaret could not know, and in the not knowing was the whole shape of her grief. Because if Alara knew and permitted it, then Margaret had spent her love on someone who would let her be humiliated to secure her own crown. And if Alara did not know, then Margaret had spent her love raising a girl so easily managed, so smoothly steered, that the people around her could rewrite 1,000 years of custom without her ever noticing. Neither possibility left her anything to stand on, and yet she stood. She did not weep in the corridor. She had promised herself that long ago in the days after her daughter died, and she kept the promise now as she had kept it then. She turned to Piers, and she saw that he was braced for her anger, braced perhaps for her to push past him, to make a scene at the door, to force her way into the right and shatter it. And she saw that some part of him hoped she would, because it would be a kind of justice, and because he loved her. She did not do it. She would not give them that. She would not be the mad old woman pounding at the door of the sacred rite, to be dragged away and pitied and, worse, dismissed. If they wished to erase her, She would not hand them the story that made the erasure look like mercy. "Thank you, peers," she said instead. "You have done nothing wrong, remember that. Whatever they say to you afterward, and someone will say something to you for having been the one to tell me, you did nothing wrong. You told me the truth kindly, and there is no fault in that. Do you understand me?" The boy nodded, unable to speak. "Good." She reached out and for a moment laid her hand against his wet cheek, as she had done when he was a child burning with fever and no one else would come. "Go home to your mother tonight. Tell her I asked after her. And Piers," she paused, "do not stay in this house longer than you must. It is not kind to the people who serve it. I learned that too late. You are young enough to learn it in time." Then she turned and she walked back down the long corridor, straight-backed, unhurried in her gray-blue gown, away from the closed doors and the muffled words of the right that was not hers. She did not look back, and every step she took, she was performing a private arithmetic she had never let herself perform before, adding up, at last, the full and terrible sum of 40 years. Here is the thing about a life of service that no one tells you. It is invisible precisely because it works. When Margaret ran the household so that the king never had to think about it, the king never thought about it. That was the point. And so he never knew there was anything to be grateful for. When she nursed the dying and fed the orphans and taught the foreign bride to hold her head, she did it so well and so quietly that it looked like nothing, like weather, like the ordinary running of the world. She had made herself indispensable in the one way that guarantees you will never be valued. She had made herself indispensable invisibly. The people who shout and demand and take credit are remembered. The people who simply hold the world together while no one is looking are forgotten the moment the world no longer needs holding. She had known this in a way for a long time, but she had never let herself sit inside the full cold truth of it until this morning, walking away from that door. She had told herself that the house would remember. She had built her whole life on the faith that virtue was a currency the house would one day repay. And the house had answered her, at last, with a closed door and a merchant's son, and the answer was this: "We never owed you anything because we never asked. You gave it freely. That was your choice, not our debt." It was true, that was the worst of it. It was entirely, unanswerably true. She reached her rooms. Her women were waiting, and they rose when she entered, their faces bright with the expectation of the morning, for they believed, as she had let them believe, that she had gone to place the crown. They saw her face, and their brightness faltered. One of them, old Hedda, who had been with her 30 years, stepped forward and said, "Your Grace, did the right?" "The right is done," Margaret said, "or nearly. Lord Valeric placed the crown." The silence that followed was the silence of women who understood exactly what that meant, because they had lived in the house long enough to understand everything. Hedda's face went white and then red. "Valeric," she said, and there was a whole life of loyalty and rage in the way she said it. That jumped-up clerk laid hands on the crown of saints. "Over you. Your Grace, this is. We must. The court will not stand for it. The old families will not." "The old families will do nothing," Margaret said gently, "because there is nothing to be done. And you will do nothing, Hedda, and neither will any of you, and I will tell you why." She sat. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the morning's walking. She looked at these women who loved her, and she chose her words with the care of someone laying out something fragile. "If we protest," she said, "we make it a scandal. And a scandal has a shape, and the shape it will take is this: a bitter old woman, passed over for a younger and more useful man, unable to bear that the world has moved beyond her. That is the story they will tell. That is the story that is easiest to tell, because it is the story people always tell about old women who want things. And every year of my service, every night I sat with the dying, every orphan I fed, all of it will be erased and replaced by that one word: bitter. I will not be the woman who gave her life to this house. I will be the woman who threw a tantrum at the door of a sacred right. That is what protest buys me. I will not buy it." Hedda was weeping now, the honest, furious tears of an old servant. "Then they win," she said. "Then they simply win, and you say nothing, you do nothing, and they win." For today, Margaret said, they win. Yes. And something moved behind her steady gray eyes, something that Hedda, watching, would try for years afterward to describe and never quite manage. But you have misunderstood me, Hedda, if you think that saying nothing is the same as doing nothing. I have said nothing for 40 years. You would be astonished at what a woman can build in the silence if she is patient, and if she stops. Her voice caught, just once, on the edge of the wound. If she stops wasting her strength on the hope of being thanked. Because here was what the morning had given her, in the cold corridor, in the closing of the door. It had taken away the last thing she had been waiting for. And a person who is waiting for something is a person who can be managed, steered, kept quiet, kept hopping. Margaret had been, without ever knowing it, the most manageable woman in Aldermere, because she had always believed that if she simply endured a little longer, served a little better, the recognition she longed for would finally come. That hope had been the leash, and this morning King Cassian and Lord Valeric had, in their cleverness, cut it. They had shown her, past all possibility of doubt, that the recognition was never coming, that there was nothing left to wait for. They thought they had defeated her. What they had actually done was set her free. For the first time in 40 years, Margaret wanted nothing from the house of Aldermere. Not its gratitude, not its honors, not its sacred rights, not its love. And a person who wants nothing from you is the single most dangerous person you can create, because there is no longer anything you can threaten them with, and nothing you can offer them to make them stop. She sat in her rooms that morning while, elsewhere in the house, her granddaughter wore a crown placed by the wrong hands. And she did not weep, and she did not rage, and slowly, quietly, in the cold, clear space where her hope had been, she began to think. She thought first of what she knew. And what Margaret knew, after 40 years at the heart of the house of Aldermere, was very nearly everything. She knew where the money came from and where it quietly went. She knew which of the great lords had sold their loyalty and to whom. She knew the true parentage of at least 2 people the court believed to be legitimate, and the false parentage of one it believed was not. She knew where the old King Aldous had hidden certain documents before he died, because she had been the one he trusted to hide them. She knew the secret that Lord Valeric had climbed 20 years to bury, the thing about his merchant father's fortune, and where it had truly come from, the thing that would end him in an afternoon if it were ever spoken in the right room. She knew because people tell the invisible woman everything, the woman who runs the household, who sits with the dying, who is always present and never counted. They tell her everything, because they never imagine she is a person who might one day use it. She had never used any of it. She had held it all in trust, because that was who she was, because she had believed that knowledge was a burden to be carried honorably and not a weapon to be wielded. She had been, in this as in everything, a keeper of the house's secrets out of love for the house. The house had just informed her, through a closed door, that the love ran only one way. Margaret rose and went to the small locked cabinet where she kept the things she had never shown anyone, and she stood before it for a long moment with the key in her hand. This was the threshold. She understood that clearly. On one side of it was the woman she had been for 61 years, patient, enduring, silent, good. On the other side was someone she did not yet know. To open the cabinet was to become that other person, and there would be no becoming the first one again. She thought of Reinhardt dying, saying you should have been the one they crowned. She thought of her daughter's coffin, small enough to carry alone. She thought of the plague summer and the orphans and the foreign bride weeping in her rooms. She thought of the fierce 9-year-old girl who had wanted things out loud, and of that same girl standing this morning with her head bared for the wrong hands, and she did not yet know whether Ilara was her victory or her greatest and most painful failure. And she thought of the cold corridor, and the closed door and young peers who could not look at her, weeping for a shame that was not his. She turned the key. What she found there she had not looked at in years, and as she drew the papers out one by one and laid them on the table in the gray morning light, a clarity came over her that felt almost like joy, the terrible clean joy of a person who has finally, after a lifetime, stopped pretending. She was not going to storm the door. She was not going to make a scandal. She was not going to be the bitter old woman raging at the world. She was going to do something far quieter and far more patient and far more complete. She was going to use everything she knew, every secret, every debt, every buried thing, not in a burst of rage that could be dismissed, but slowly, precisely, over the weeks and months to come, until the men who had closed that door discovered that the invisible woman they had erased had been holding the foundations of their world in her hands the entire time, and had simply, this morning, decided to stop holding them up. Outside her window, the coldest spring in 40 years pressed gray against the glass. Behind a closed door across the house, a crown sat on a young head, and in a quiet room, an old woman who had spent her whole life being overlooked began, at last, to make herself impossible to overlook ever again. But she would need one thing she did not yet have. She would need to know the answer to the question that had haunted her since the corridor, the only question that still had the power to change everything. She would need to know whether Alara had known. And so that evening she sent a single message, not to the king, not to Valeric, to her granddaughter. 3 words in her own hand, sealed with the old crest of the house of Reinhardt that no one had used in years. Come to me. Alara came at midnight. She came alone, without attendants, still in the pale ceremonial gown she had worn for the rite, and when Hedda opened the door to her, the old servant's face went through 3 separate wars before it settled into a stiff, wounded courtesy. Alara saw it. Alara had been trained by the finest teacher in Aldermere to see exactly such things, and the teacher was sitting by the fire across the room, straight-backed, waiting, and did not rise when her granddaughter entered. That, too, Alara saw. Her grandmother had risen for her every day of her life. The not rising was a sentence spoken without words, and Alara stood in the doorway and read it, and something in her young face broke open. You knew, Margaret said. It was not a question. She had decided, sitting there through the long evening, that she would not ask it as a question. She would state it and watch, and the truth would show itself in the first unguarded instant, because that was the one thing training could never fully hide, the first instant. And in the first instant, Alara's face showed her not guilt but horror. Knew what? Alara said, and crossed the room too fast, and actually knelt in her ceremonial gown on the cold stone by her grandmother's chair, which no future queen should ever do and which she did without a thought. Grandmother, what has happened? What have they? You weren't there. I looked for you. When they brought me in, I looked for you at the Crown, because it was to be you, it was always to be you. You told me the story 100 times. The eldest of the house places the crown, and I looked, and it was Valeric, and I did not understand, and they had already begun the words, and I could not stop it without. She stopped. Her hands had found her grandmother's and gripped them. Where were you? Why were you not there? Margaret looked down at the girl's face and performed, in a few seconds, the most important reading of her long life. She had spent 61 years learning to tell truth from performance, and everything she knew told her the same thing. This was not performance. Alara had not known. The horror was real, and the searching for her at the Crown was real, and the not understanding was real. They had kept it from the girl, too. Of course they had. It was cleaner that way. An heir who did not know she was being managed was an heir who could not object. They had arranged the whole thing so smoothly that Alara had stood through her own most sacred rites sensing something was wrong and unable to name it. And now she knelt on the cold floor discovering it, and the discovering was breaking her. And Margaret felt the great cold thing in her chest, the thing she had built through the long evening, the beautiful, terrible clarity of a woman who wanted nothing and could therefore do anything. She felt it shift, not vanish, but shift and make room for something she had not expected to feel again tonight. Because here was the truth she had not let herself hope for. Her love had not been wasted. The girl she had made was not a smooth, managed thing that would let her grandmother be humiliated to secure a crown. The girl she had made was kneeling on the floor, gripping her hands, ready. Margaret could see it building in her face. ready to burn the whole right down, to renounce it, to march into the king's chambers at midnight and fling the thing back at him. Which meant Margaret now had to do the hardest thing she had done all day. She had to stop her. "Get up," she said gently. "Sit, not on the floor. You are the heir of Aldermere, and you will not kneel on cold stone, not even for me, especially not for me. Sit in the chair and listen, because I am going to tell you the truth of this house, and it is not a kind truth, and you are going to need every word of it." Alara rose and sat and listened, and Margaret told her. She told her all of it, not the secrets in the cabinet, not yet, but the shape of the thing. She told her what 40 years of service had looked like and what it had bought. She told her how the invisible woman is made and why she is forgotten. She told her about the leash of hope and how it is used to keep good people quiet, and how the king and Valeric had cut it that morning without understanding what they were cutting. She watched her granddaughter's face move from horror to grief to a cold, dawning fury, and she held up her hand before the fury could find its shape. "No," she said, "not that. Listen to me, because this is the lesson, this is the whole lesson, and if you learn it tonight you will be a greater queen than any this house has seen. You are angry. Good. Anger is honest. But you want to use it now tonight loudly. You want to go to Cassian and throw it in his face. And if you do, you will lose. You will be the young hysterical heir who cannot control herself, and they will use that story for the rest of your reign, and every hard thing you ever try to do will be met with remember how she was, that first night, so emotional. They will have written you before you have written yourself." "Then what?" Alara said, and her voice was raw. "Then what do I do with this? I sit, I smile, I let them do to me what they did to you, 40 years of it, and say nothing." "No," Margaret leaned forward. The firelight was on her silver hair. "You do what I did not learn to do until it was too late. You say nothing and you do everything. You let them believe tonight that the girl noticed nothing, that the rite went smoothly, that the old grandmother took her erasure quietly as old grandmothers do. You let them relax. And meanwhile," she rose now at last, and went to the small locked cabinet, and turned the key, and Alara watched with wide eyes as her grandmother drew out the papers she had been guarding for a lifetime. "Meanwhile, I am going to give you what no one has ever thought to give an heir of this house. I am going to give you the house itself. Everything I know. Every secret, every debt, every buried thing. Where the money goes. Who is loyal and who has sold themselves. What Valeric truly is and where his father's fortune came from. I have carried all of it for 40 years because I loved this house and thought that was what love meant. I was wrong. This is not a house that love holds up. It is a house that knowledge holds up. And I am going to hand you the knowledge, and you are going to hold it quietly, and you are going to become queen, and one day, not tomorrow, not in a year, but one day, when you are ready and no one can call it the tantrum of a girl, you are going to make certain that the people in this house are valued for what they give, because you will have the power to make it so, and you will remember tonight." She laid the papers on the table between them. Alara looked at them and did not touch them, understanding, as her grandmother had understood that morning, that to touch them was to cross a threshold. "Why?" Alara said quietly. "Why give this to me and not use it yourself? You could ruin Valeric tomorrow. You just said so. You could make Cassian pay. Why hand it to me instead?" And Margaret smiled, the first real smile in a day that had held none. "Because I am 61 years old and free, and you are young and about to be queen. Because revenge is a small thing, and you are meant for a large one. Because if I use this to burn them, then all I have done is prove that the invisible woman was dangerous, and they will simply make certain the next invisible woman is watched. But if you use it patiently, quietly over a whole reign, to build a house where the invisible ones are seen, then I have not had my revenge. I have had something better. I have had my life's work finally count." She touched the papers. "They closed a door on me this morning, Alara. Let us not spend what is left of my strength trying to force it open. Let us build you a house with no such doors in it at all." Alara was crying now, silently. the tears running down a face that was so like the face Margaret saw in her own glass 40 years ago. And then the girl reached out and took the papers, and held them against herself and crossed the threshold and became, in that small midnight motion, someone new. Someone who would want things out loud as she always had, but who now also knew how to want them in silence, which is the harder and more powerful art. "Tell me everything," Alara said. "Tonight, all of it. And grandmother," she gripped the papers, "when I am queen, the first right of my reign, the very first, will be to name the eldest of the house to a place at the center of everything. In law, so that it can never again be done to anyone, so that no one ever again stands outside that door." "I know," Margaret said. "That is why I am giving it to you and not to anyone else in the world." They talked until dawn. The old woman gave the young one the accumulated knowledge of 40 years, secret by secret, name by name, and as the gray light came up over the coldest spring in 4 decades, the two of them sat close by the dying fire, and something passed between them that was larger than a crown and older than the crown of saints. The thing that actually holds houses up, when knowledge and gold and sacred rights have all failed. One person, at last, truly seeing another. The reign of Queen Alara of Aldermere lasted 41 years, and the historians who wrote of it afterwards struggled to explain why it was so different from what came before, why the court under Alara valued the quiet servants and the unglamorous work, why the people who held the world together were, for the first time anyone could remember, actually thanked. They noted that she had been close to her grandmother, the old Duchess Margaret, who had died in the 3rd year of the reign, full of years, and by all accounts at peace. They did not know about the midnight, or the papers, or the cabinet. They did not know that the whole shape of a golden age had been decided in a single cold room by 2 women the house had tried to overlook. They did not know that in the great hall of Aldermere, where the law of the realm was carved into the stone for all to read, Alara had ordered added, in the 1st year of her reign, a single new statute that no one entirely understood. It concerned the right of the crown of saints, and it stated, in plain and unadorned language, that the crown was to be placed upon each new heir by the eldest surviving member of the royal house, without exception, without substitution, and that no officer of the realm, however high, might ever stand in that place. Beneath it, smaller, was a line that the stonemasons had been puzzled to carve, because it did not read like law at all. It read, "so that no one stands outside the door." And every heir of Aldermere for 200 years was crowned by the oldest of the house, in a right that could not be rewritten, while somewhere in the cold stone the memory held of a gray morning, and a closed door, and an old woman who had walked away from it straight-backed and unweeping, and who had, in her silence, changed everything.